The Holy Gospel according to St. Matthew, the 4th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. He fasted 40 days and 40 nights, and afterwards he was famished. And the tempter came and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." But he answered, "It is written, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." Then the devil took him to the holy city, placed him on the pinnacle of the temple, saying to him, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you, and on their hands they will bear you up so that you will not dash your foot against a stone." Jesus said to him, "Again, it is written, do not put the Lord your God to the test." Again the devil took him to a very high mountain, showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, and he said to him, "All of these I will give you, if you will fall down and worship me." And Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Please be seated. A few years ago, approximately 1,000 students filed into this huge cavernous lecture hall at The Ohio State University in order to take their calculus final. Apparently, however, the professor of this class wasn't very well liked by the students. That's because he was the kind of teacher who every few minutes during the exams would shout out exactly how much time was left. And then immediately add, trying to be funny, I guess, that for many of the students it was also how much time they likely had left to fail their exam as well. And this, of course, would rattle or at the very least irritate most of the students. And when he wasn't announcing the remaining time left in the test, he was constantly walking around the lecture hall and looking over their shoulders in order to make sure that no one was cheating, which, needless to say, was also very distracting and nerve-wracking. And since he was so busy trying to catch cheaters and announcing how much time they had left, he had instructed that once they were finished taking their tests and before they left the lecture hall, the students should stack their completed exams on the table at the very front of the room. And as you might well imagine, this resulted in several good-sized stacks, given that there were, again, nearly 1,000 students in the class. Well, taking the exam that day was one student who especially needed a decent grade to just pass the course. His only problem, and with calculus in particular, was that he always did poorly on exams when he felt rushed or when someone was constantly hovering over him. And so this exam and this professor were for him at least a perfect recipe for disaster. Nevertheless, in trying hard to ignore the professor, he buckled down and did his best to concentrate. And furthermore, because he wanted to assure himself of a good grade, he didn't even stop writing when the professor called out, "Time, put down your pencils." Instead, while everyone else complied with the professor's directions, he simply kept working. 5 minutes soon turned into 10, 10 into 20, then 20 into 40. And this entire time, the professor just stood there in front of the lecture hall, strangely patient, waiting for him to finish, but also glaring at him the entire time. Finally, almost an hour after the test was officially over, the young man put down his pencil, gathered up his work, and headed to the front of the hall to submit his final exam. When the student walked up to where the now obviously enraged professor was waiting for him, the professor angrily asked him, "Just what do you think you're doing?" "Turning in my exam," the student calmly replied. "I'm afraid then that I have some very bad news for you," said the professor. "The exam ended an hour ago. You're too late, and therefore you automatically fail. I guess I'll be seeing you again next semester," he sneered. The student, however, just smiled back at the professor, this strange, sly smile spreading across his face. "Do you know who I am?" he asked the professor. "What do you mean?" replied the professor gruffly, annoyed that the student showed absolutely no signs of worry or concern. And so the student rephrased the question in a slightly mocking tone. "What I meant to say is, do you know my name?" "No, of course not," snarled the professor. "There are nearly 1,000 students in this section of calculus alone." The student then looked at the professor straight in the eye and said slowly, "I didn't think so." And as he said this, he lifted up one of the stacks of exams halfway, shoved his neatly into the center of the stack and let the rest fall into place, thus burying his test somewhere in the middle, with no way of being able to tell which exam in the pile was his. And with that, he simply turned around and casually walked out of the lecture hall. Now, there was more than a simple calculus test going on in that lecture hall, wasn't there? You might say that it was also a test of wills between that student and the professor. And in this instance, at least, I'd say that the student got the best of his professor. Well, in today's reading, we heard about another test, the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. But more importantly, I would argue, it was also a test of wills between Jesus and the devil. What's particularly interesting here is that the word translated as tempted in the first verse of our passage actually means to make a trial of, or simply to test, especially for the purpose of ascertaining someone's faith or virtue or character. In other words, fresh from his baptism in the River Jordan, according to Matthew, Jesus was now led by the Spirit out into the wilderness to be tested. And so the obvious question is, was this test really necessary? After all, this was the Son of God. The voice from heaven, presumably God's, confirmed that at Jesus' baptism when it said, we heard, "This is my Son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." Didn't such an endorsement make it perfectly clear that Jesus' faith and virtue and character were completely beyond reproach? Since Jesus was the Son of God and therefore presumably immune to temptation and sin, what purpose then did this testing in the wilderness possibly serve? Now, tests and testing have never been very high on anyone's list of favorite things, not for most of us, I would think. In fact, in recent years, even in education, the whole idea of testing has actually been questioned, has come under increased scrutiny. For instance, more and more colleges and universities, from what I understand, are no longer using the test scores from the SAT or the ACT to help determine admissions. Many of them are now only using those tests for placement purposes once a student has already been accepted. Among the schools no longer putting as much emphasis on these standardized tests are some larger ones like Arizona State, Texas A&M, and LSU. It's also true of many of the prestigious smaller colleges like Drew University here in New Jersey or Middlebury College in Vermont. Well, my point here is simply this. Increasingly many schools and even some educators are questioning the necessity of some of these standardized tests. Nevertheless, they'll probably still be around for the foreseeable future. But then there's some other tests that just make absolutely no sense, however. Consider this. Imagine you're at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and you're a brilliant student. MIT brilliant. You've aced all your engineering exams and computer science courses, but there's one test left for you to take before you can graduate. And has nothing at all to do with engineering or computers. It's this. You have to swim 100 yards. That's right, swim 100 yards. According to Douglas Belkin, writing a few years ago in the Boston Globe, that was the situation faced by Stephanie Yee in the spring of 2006. You see, at the time at least, MIT was one of a handful of top schools in the country that actually required its students to pass a swimming test before they graduated. Yee, who had never learned how to swim as a child, apparently questioned the rationale behind just such a test. Her response to the swimming requirement was, who cares if you can swim or not? In other words, was this test really necessary? Interestingly enough, when my brother Dave attended Monmouth College, now Monmouth University over Long Branch, back in the late 70s, that school still had a swimming requirement as well. Maybe it still does. And while Dave did know how to swim, he wasn't a very strong swimmer, however. And I remember him telling me that when it came time to be tested, he found himself in the pool with a whole bunch of other students. The requirement, as I recall, was 4 lengths of the pool. In other words, up and back, and then up and back again. Dave, though was such a poor swimmer and so slow as well, that all the other students quickly swam way ahead of him. But again, since there were so many swimmers as well as different levels of ability, the class was quickly spread out to the extent that you could no longer really tell which leg of the swim they were on. Fortunately for Dave, just as he was completing his first up and back, a large number of the other swimmers were already finishing the entire swim, And so quick thinker that he is, he simply climbed up out of the pool with the rest of them lying, got into line, and then when it was his turn, merely gave his name to the instructor as if he had finished the entire swim as well. And that's how he managed to pass the swimming test at Monmouth College and become eligible to graduate. Now, is swimming a swimming requirement for college graduation really necessary? It's probably not a bad thing. But then again, if you're someone who gets into the water about as often as my brother Dave, it's hardly a necessary thing. Which brings us back to Jesus' testing in the wilderness. As the Son of God, one whose faith, virtue, and character were beyond reproach, and one who was presumably immune to temptation and sin, it hardly seems a necessary thing. Again, what possible purpose did it serve? Back in the 19th century, as the Union Pacific Railroad was being constructed, an elaborate trestle bridge was built across a large canyon out west. And wanting to test the bridge, the builder loaded a train with enough extra cars and equipment to double the normal payload. The train was then driven to the middle of the bridge and left there overnight. The next morning, when the workers got up and saw the bridge still standing with that heavy train parked right in the middle of it where it had been left the night before, one of them walked up to the builder and said, "What were you trying to do, break the bridge?" "No," replied the builder calmly. "I was merely trying to prove that the bridge won't break." In the same way, it's been said that the temptations Jesus faced out there in the wilderness weren't designed to see if he would sin. Rather, they were meant to prove that he couldn't. And so is this test really necessary? If we mean by that question, did Jesus have to somehow prove himself, that there were possibly some doubts about his character, whether he could fulfill the mission for which he'd been sent, then the answer is an unequivocal no. Jesus was the Son of God, and therefore the outcome of his testing was never in doubt. It was a foregone conclusion. But if, on the other hand, we mean by that question that this was an opportunity for Jesus to demonstrate his true character and nature, and to assure everyone, including the devil, that he was more than up to the task, then the answer is an emphatic yes. Today's gospel tells us that the devil took his best shot, and not unlike the story about that student and his professor, it was again a test of wills. Jesus was first tempted to exploit his power by turning stones into bread in order to alleviate his hunger. Jesus refused. "One does not live by bread alone," he told the devil, "but by every word that comes from the mouth of God." The second one was actually an attempt to get Jesus to tempt God by throwing himself from the pinnacle of the temple in Jerusalem. And once again, Jesus refused. "Do not put the Lord your God to the test," he said. Finally, the devil took him up to the top of a high mountain, showed him the fabulous splendor of all the earth's kingdoms. "All this will be yours," said the devil, "if only you'll fall down and worship me." The third temptation then was for Jesus to use the kingdoms of this world for his own satisfaction. But yet again, Jesus refused. "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." And at that point, as we heard, the contest was suddenly over. The test of wills had been waged, and Jesus had won. It was like that student inserting his exam into the middle of the stack and then calmly challenging his professor to fail him when the professor didn't even know his name. I can even imagine Jesus standing there toe-to-toe with the devil with a knowing smile on his face. The contest of wills was over, you see, and just like that student, Jesus stood there knowing, without any doubt whatsoever, that there was absolutely nothing the devil could now do to him, as it was not even a cross could later stop him. Not that the devil gave up so easily, however. As Luke adds in his own account of this very same event, when the devil had finished every test, he departed from Jesus until an opportune time. And as we know, even from reading the rest of Matthew's gospel, the devil and his intermediaries continued to test Jesus time and time again, relentlessly trying to trick Jesus or trip him up, but all to no avail. Again, it's at this point that our lesson this morning ends rather abruptly, if you notice. Because for Matthew, at least, there's really nothing more to be said or done at this point. In this contest of wills, Jesus was the clear and unquestioned victor. And therefore, as we move then through this season of Lent, indeed as we move through the seasons of our lives, with all the pain and suffering and disappointment that accompany our journey, it's comforting to know that we have placed our faith, and with it those very lives, in the hands of a Savior who stood up to evil in a way that we never could. It's comforting to know that we have a Savior who was tempted as we are, but did not give in to sin. It's comforting to know that we have a Savior who took the ultimate test and proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that he could be trusted. And that because he could be trusted, we will never again have to fear the power of sin, death, or evil. Amen.